Welcome back. Okay, we saw a rare glimmer of hope at the end of the last part of the lecture there, where we're saying, you know what, we got to reduce our emissions, and maybe we could do it by reducing our carbon intensity. We can't fix population, we can't fix affluence, and there's just only so much we can do with regard to energy intensity, but maybe carbon intensity. Maybe we can change the amount of carbon dioxide that's emitted per joule of energy we produce. And we certainly have a menu of options with regard to technologies that can be used to reduce our carbon intensity. We need to switch to some of these. We got to get away from the fossil fuels to energy that is carbon-free. Okay, you'll notice that terminology when you look through the book. And we certainly have a whole menu of options of, carbon-free technologies. Nuclear energy, we're going to talk about carbon capture and sequestration. We can talk about all the different renewable energy choices like hydroelectric and solar and wind and biomass and so on. All of which have the potential to do something good for us in terms of that carbon intensity term. But remember, if we can get that carbon intensity down, we would be starting to reduce our emissions and maybe get ourselves on a somewhat better path with regard to climate change. And if we could get that CI term all the way to zero by having no more carbon emissions, then we'd be talking. Alright, so let's actually start picking these apart. Now, in no particular order here, how about solar power? Okay, solar power is sort of the big obvious choice when we're talking about a renewable source of energy here. In practice, solar power tends to be two separate technologies: solar voltaic cells and solar thermal methods. The ones that you see here on the screen, these are all examples of solar photovoltaic cells, and in fact, probably what you're thinking of when you think of solar power is, solar photovoltaic cells. We're not going to get into the engineering of how these things work, but they're layers of different semiconducting materials that when they're exposed to sunlight, electrons move from layer to layer and it produces voltages of direct current. There's tons of this going on at Creighton. There's tons of this. You drive around in different neighborhoods, people have them on their roofs and so on. The International Space Station has big photovoltaic cells generating its electricity. It's a technology. It exists. There's also this whole business of solar thermal methods that aren't really practical like at the household level, but there are energy companies and so on where they use like reflective panels on the ground to redirect solar energy towards some kind of tower where the solar energy is used as kind of making a solar oven. It heats a fluid which is then used to boil water and turn turbines that make electricity. There are power companies that experiment with this kinds of technology and so on. I think there is some operational production of electricity in the Southwest that's done this way and so on. But I mean, both technologies have pros and cons, but they're both ways of producing completely clean, renewable solar energy. And, that makes environmental science majors very happy. That makes energy majors very happy. But that's not to say that there aren't problems with solar panels. And just the other day, my 6-year-old came up to me and asked me a difficult question about it. He says, "What do you do about solar power?" We saw somebody who had solar panels on their roof as we were driving down the road. Their house had solar panels. He says, "What do you do about solar panels when it's cloudy and there's not sunlight?" That's right. That is a problem we call intermittency. Intermittency has to do with the fact that this is not a continuous source of power the way a coal-fired power plant is, or a nuclear power plant, or a natural gas plant. It only works when there is sunlight on the panels. The panels produce less electricity on a cloudy day than they do on a clear day. And your plan to make all the power for your city be solar power means that you need to have something to deal with the fact that sometimes it's going to be cloudy and you need to buy energy off the grid from someplace else that has excess power to sell. That has to be part of the plan. You can't just have brownouts on the days that are cloudy. Same with another example of an intermittency problem with solar is, of course, night, right? Half the hours of the year, the sun is not up where you are. Therefore, you have to have a plan. Now, there's anything from buying electricity off the grid to storing electricity in large batteries. During the day you produce excess electricity that is put into the batteries for use at night. There's lots of solutions around this, but they all take money, they all take planning, they all take engineering, and so on. Okay, so intermittency is a big problem for solar, but another big problem for solar is it doesn't actually produce all that much power per square meter of solar panel. I mean, when you see a whole roof covered with solar panels, it looks very high-tech and cool, but it is not very likely that that is producing anywhere near as much electricity as the house is using. All those solar panels out in that parking lot at Creighton, all of them together only produce enough power to power like a few computers and so on, or the lights for one building or something like that. They don't actually produce that much power per square meter of panel. Now, this is something that could be dealt with. I mean, for example, to meet the world's power needs, we would need to cover approximately 1 million square kilometers with photovoltaic cells, which sounds impossible. I mean, that is 0.2% of the surface of the Earth. That is an awful lot of the Earth to be covering with solar panels, especially if you ever try to get a price and find out that, gee, the solar panels on your roof would cost $40,000 or something. Wow, suddenly we got to cover about 0.2% of the whole surface of the Earth. Well, that's, as your book points out, that's approximately the same fraction of the Earth as is currently covered with cities. We have already built stuff that covers that much of the surface of the Earth. Apparently, it's something we can do, right? So, I mean, why not build these things and cover a comparable area of the Earth? In fact, they could be co-located, like the solar panels could be on the roofs of the buildings. Or you occasionally see these stories about like roads that are made of a photovoltaic material so that the road surface itself generates electricity and so on. There's reasons why that particular plan is horrible, but roofs and parking lots and stuff like that, there's no particular reason why they couldn't be made of solar voltaic cells. It would be an enormous undertaking to build this, but not as big of an undertaking as, say, building America. I mean, all this built infrastructure around us of bridges and roads and stuff like that was a vastly larger expense than this would be. We did it before. Why can't we do it now? Good question. Maybe we could. How about wind power? Hey, everybody has feelings one way or the other about the big wind turbines that are out there as to whether they're wonderful or horrible. We're merely talking about them here in the context of climate change. There are other environmental problems with wind power, like, they kill birds and they interfere with the migration patterns of whatever and so on. But what about wind power itself as just a green energy solution? Could we actually build enough wind power plants to meet our energy needs? Well, it turns out you would need to cover about 1.5% of the surface of the Earth with wind power farms, which at first sounds like a heck of a lot, but it only adds up to a few million turbines. A few million turbines? Oh my gosh, have you seen those things? Like, they build them out west of Omaha at Valmont. You might have seen where they actually manufacture these things and bring them out on those giant trucks. They're huge. We're going to need a few million of those things? Can we afford that? Well, as your book points out, it's on the same scale of an expense as, say, World War II. World War II, we had to produce, we and the Japanese and the Russians and the Germans and the British produced millions of tanks and aircraft and supply ships and munitions and so on. It would be an industrial project on approximately that same scale. Well, on the one hand, holy smokes, that was an enormous project. On the other hand, we did it. And we changed the world. I mean, you can decide for yourself what you think of World War II, but it was an expense, and we did it, and we borrowed the money, and we paid it off, and the world is the way it is today because we did it. And you know what? It would be an effort on about the same scale. It would not be, oh, we'll put up a few windmills on this Native American reservation if the tax incentives are right. No, we would just make up our minds, we're spending the money, and we would do it. We could do it. All right? That's not to say that wind is a perfect solution. Much like solar, wind has issues of intermittency. If the wind isn't blowing at any given time, you're not getting power, and you need to plan for that. You need to have a plan that says we're going to buy power off the grid from other sources, or we will store excess power when we have a lot of wind in batteries. In some cities around the world, they use wind power. The excess energy is used to pump water from one lake to a higher lake. They pump from like one side of a dam to the other side of the dam, and then when there's intermittency issues, they release water from the dam over and make hydroelectric power. So effectively, they've stored the electricity from the wind power in the form of this higher lake, and they let the water flow back down. You're going to have a plan. All those plans require money, all those plans require engineering, all of them require planning. But we can do that. It exists. Those are plans that exist. The problem at the present time is actually getting somebody to pay for any of this stuff. At the present time, both solar and wind cost significantly more per watt produced, or whatever unit you want to use, than fossil fuels do. Fossil fuels is just such an amazingly mature technology. We can mine it on an industrial scale with very few people involved, with equipment that's already paid for, run it on train tracks that have been there for 150 years to a coal plant that's been paid for 50 years, and burn it so efficiently and distribute it on aging networks of wires, and it's all just so cheap. And green renewable solutions just can't compete on cost of that yet. Although every year the cost structure gets more and more favorable for the green solutions. How about another technology that might be useful as a way to reduce carbon intensity, and that would be biomass energy. Now, the most common example of biomass energy that you might be familiar with is ethanol, where we turn corn into a type of gasoline, to a fuel for vehicles. In general, biomass energy is about turning crops that are growing crops that get converted into a fuel. In the US, this is largely done in the form of corn, but in other parts of the world it's done using wheat, of all bizarre things. In South America, they have a crop called switchgrass, where the grass itself grows really fast, and they use the grass itself to produce the fuel, and so on. Biomass burning, you go to the gas station and you choose the pump with, with 10% ethanol or whatever, and it's usually got like a little green leaf and it, your environmental choice or whatever, blah, blah, blah. Well, kind of. Biofuels are kind of carbon neutral. I mean, the life cycle of the plants, plus the burning of the fuel itself, is kind of a self-contained carbon neutral thing. The plants pull the carbon out of the atmosphere, burning the fuel puts the same amount of carbon back in the atmosphere. Ta-da! We've kind of got a sort of carbon neutral solution here. That being said, there is sort of some overhead here. The carbon involved in like running the tractors to grow the crops and produce the fertilizers that were fertilizing the crops, and the trucks that transported the crops to the ethanol plant and so on, all that is not carbon neutral. So depending on how the crops are raised, it may be more or less carbon neutral. I mean, you can have if the crops can be raised with very little human intervention and very few times do the tractors pass over the field and so on, and with very few chemicals used, you might actually have a fairly close to carbon neutral system here. But that does not mean that biomass fuel is actually a good idea. I mean, for one thing, it's not all that efficient. You don't actually get that much fuel out of, say, 1 acre of corn as you might think. In fact, to meet our current energy needs for the world, about 15% of the surface of the Earth would have to be dedicated to raising crops that are just being used as a fuel. To put that in perspective, 15% is approximately how much of the surface of the Earth we use now to raise food. Okay, where are we going to find 15% more of the Earth that is arable land that we can use for growing crops that are just going to get burned in our sport utility vehicles? This is not an obvious question. The other thing is, well, there's actually a couple other problems with biofuels. One of them is it inflates the prices of fuel, of grains and other foods. And so this, because it provides another demand for corn or wheat or switchgrass or whatever, it stimulates demand for countries to cut down forests and start raising fuel. Like this, according to the Wikipedia search I did on here, this is a soybean field where there used to be rainforest. Okay. I don't know if people are eating these soybeans or if these soybeans are going to be used as a biofuel, but the forest was cut down because it was economically more useful to have the soybeans here. And the reason why the price of the soybeans was so high was because of biofuels. It's not obvious that that's a good idea, at least from a carbon point of view. I mean, from the cutting down the rainforest idea, that's a whole bad idea. But from a carbon point of view, wasn't the forest doing better anyway? Wasn't the forest doing a better idea, providing long-term sequestration of the carbon dioxide anyway? Why did we cut it down to put soybeans there? Plus, frankly, a lot of the agricultural practices associated with these biofuels are not particularly good. They have a lot of environmental problems, including things like fertilizer runoff and soil erosion and so on. These are not necessarily such great options for other environmental reasons, but really in some ways the biggest issue is what the stress this puts on the food supply. This is food you're burning in your car. Okay, when you go to the gas pump and you buy the cheapest grade, in the United States the cheapest grade has, what is it, 10%, 15%, whatever it is, ethanol. That's food. That's food that went into your gas tank, 10% of it. Okay, that food was paid, you're paying a certain price for that, and you're competing on the marketplace for that food. That is food that otherwise might have been paid a lower price for someone in a developing country for a meal. Right? You're competing with them for food, you're competing for it to burn in your car. Okay? There's not really much question here. That's pretty unethical, right? The major stresses on food supply that are created by these artificial demands, okay, can price people out of the availability of rice or corn or wheat or whatever. This is not really, it's not really unclear that this is unethical. How about another technology that can reduce our carbon intensity? Remember, we're trying to get carbon intensity. It'd be best if we could get carbon intensity all the way down to 0 and not be burning fossil fuels at all. Well, how about hydroelectric? There's a technology that's been around for centuries. We should be able to get power from hydroelectric dams, and in fact we do. In fact, at the present time, worldwide, about 16% of all electricity is generated by hydroelectric energy. Okay, fantastic. Apparently it's a mature technology. We know how to safely install. Very rarely do you hear of dams failing. Very rarely. It's a safe, reliable technology, but there's all kinds of problems. One, we probably can't actually increase this all that much. Most of the economically viable locations to build a dam already have a dam. Okay, there aren't that many more places where you can build a dam and, you know, back the water up at an appropriate depth. The height of the dam determines how much water will back up behind it and also how much electricity it'll produce. So there's, you know, you have to have certain landforms around to make the reservoir behind it and so on. Turns out we've pretty much built them wherever they can be built. There's probably some capacity to build some more, but we're not going to like quadruple this anytime soon, okay? We might get a few % more power from hydroelectric in the future, but it is not going to be a lot. In the same way, dams actually have all kinds of other environmental problems too. When a dam is going in, whatever was upstream from that dam is now going to be underwater, whether that's towns or habitats for creatures, whether that is economically useful factories or economically useful fields, whether that was forests that were, you know, extracting carbon from the atmosphere. Damming the river has all kinds of consequences for the wildlife in the river, like salmon and beavers and things like that. There are just no end of problems to dam construction. It's not that we're never going to build another dam, but realistically, the great age of dam construction is probably over. Okay, we're probably not going to get vastly more power from hydroelectric. Well, let's turn to nuclear then. Okay, how about nuclear energy? Boy. If you want to get an environmental science major worked up, ask them about nuclear, because they're all over the map on that subject, and they really should be. Nuclear energy is a complicated issue. It makes up 16% of the world's energy, and we have in many ways no real idea what to do with any of it. I mean, there's lots of reasons to be an opponent of nuclear energy. There's no doubt about it. An important issue is the issues of safety and accidents. 3 Mile Island, Chernobyl, Fukushima, all those are very serious issues, okay? Accidents and safety at these kind of plants can be a very big deal. For that matter, we have to worry about terrorism. Okay, both the plants could be a target for terrorism, although most of the plants are pretty well protected from that, but they could also be where terrorists acquire nuclear materials and so on. I mean, this is a difficult issue as to how exactly we can protect these sites, especially as we spread them over more and more of the world. Oh my goodness, don't even get me started on the subject of what we do with nuclear waste. Nuclear waste is mostly, at the present time in the United States, just stored on site next to the reactor. We make a big, deep pool, and we toss the spent nuclear rods into the pool, where they will cool until we put them in a long-term storage someplace, which does not, in fact, exist. There are no long-term nuclear waste storage facilities in the United States, and there probably never will be. Some countries outside, like in Europe, do have a long-term nuclear waste storage plan, but it's a nightmare. I mean, how do you protect these facilities from terrorism, or from acts of war, or from natural disasters, or from leakage, or whatever? Nuclear waste is a big problem. Maybe there's a way to solve it. If we need this energy in this way, we might be able to solve this, but that is something we got to deal with. There's also issues of nuclear proliferation. In part, some of the technologies that are used in nuclear energy can be applied to the production of weapons-grade nuclear fuels. Some of the byproducts of the nuclear processes, the nuclear energy process, are in fact usable as dirty bombs, or as fuel for like hydrogen bombs and so on. If you build more nuclear plants in more parts around the world, you need to have a plan as to how you're going to keep those people from accessing those technologies or those byproducts or whatever. That's a big deal. It's why the United States was skeptical about letting Iran have nuclear technologies. Okay? Once you have it, you have access to those materials, you have access to those techniques, you have access to those machines, all of which you didn't have before. All right? There's also cost issues. Once a nuclear plant is running, it's actually a remarkably cost-effective thing to actually operate a nuclear power plant. Building a nuclear power plant is ridiculously expensive and very, very risky. The United States does not have a great track record of building nuclear power plants since about the 70s, when 3 Mile Island happened. I live in Indiana, as you know, and here in Indiana there are exactly 0 working nuclear power plants. But there are several that got started being built, spent a few $1 billion, and then public sentiment turned on them. The residents wouldn't agree to issuing more bonds and so on to pay for the completion, and the power companies were just out. You know, $2.5 billion on this nuclear reactor, $1.5 billion on that one. It adds up to real money. Nebraska has several nuclear power plants that actually do provide its power. Fort Calhoun, there's one in Brownville, I think there's one in Norfolk. But, you know, so those investments paid off, or at least have the ability to pay themselves off. But a nuclear plant costs billions before you get your first joule of energy out of them. Once you have it built, it's pretty efficient. But building the things are ridiculously expensive. But there's no doubt about it. There's no doubt about it. Nuclear power is green from a climate point of view. From a climate point of view, if we're just talking in terms of carbon, there's no carbon involved. I know you see stuff coming out of these cooling towers here, but that's just water. Okay, they were cooling in these towers here, and then kind of a steam came off there that condensed into these kind of clouds. From a carbon point of view, the thing is clean. And there's no doubt about it, nuclear power can be safe. We get 16% of our power worldwide from there, and there's basically 3 disasters you can mention. Okay, frankly, more people die at coal-fired power plants and natural gas plants and things like that. Nuclear power is a mature technology. That means that there's no real risk here in the sense of, like, we don't know if it'll work. Okay, if we want to set up some kind of solar thermal plant, it might not work, or it might turn out to be economically viable. No, we know the exact economics of a nuclear power plant. Okay, if you want to issue the bonds or take out or get stock in, take out stock in a company that's going to build them or whatever, it can be done. All right, and we know it is economically viable, even though it costs a heck of a lot of upfront money to build the plant. In fact, there's a reason why there's nuclear plants in, nuclear power plants in 75 countries around the world and so on, because it works and it makes money. You don't expect us to be all that bullish on nuclear power in a class with environmental sciences in the name, but it works. Nuclear power could be part of our story of getting carbon intensity back down to very low values. You know what else might work? We might just take our existing coal-fired power plants like this one and add carbon capture and sequestration technologies. Carbon capture, as in we're going to capture the carbon dioxide, and sequestration, as in we're going to then stick it someplace, put it away, so it won't get out there. See, right now I've got these stacks. Now, once again, the white stuff you see coming out of these stacks is not carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide is colorless. This is cloud. It is water vapor that condensed into little droplets as it went out the top of the smokestack. But it's loaded with carbon dioxide in there, too. Don't let that go out. Don't let that go out the smokestack. Now, this kind of technology, which usually goes by the acronym CCS for carbon capture and sequestration, Sounds a little bit science fiction-y, but actually it's not. The actual part about capturing the carbon can be done. Okay. There's actually a whole laundry list of technologies that can be used there in your book. Rather annoyingly does go through them a little bit. But suffice it to say, yes, you can make it so that the carbon dioxide from burnt combustion of that coal or natural gas or whatever is not going out the stack. Alright, the capturing of the carbon dioxide is not such a big deal. The question is where you're going to sequester it or store it. I mean, hooray, you now have some giant tank of compressed carbon dioxide, and what you going to do with that? Well, it turns out you pretty much have to store it underground. Any place at the surface is just too risky. If the gas ever got out, it would be a suffocation hazard. It would be a giant sudden emission of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. You pretty much have to store it in the ground, which actually is not as impossible as you might seem. We can pump it down into, say, porous sedimentary rocks, kind of the opposite of drilling for natural gas. We're going to drill a big pipe in the ground and pump carbon dioxide into there, and it turns out it can kind of dissolve, for lack of a better word, into porous sedimentary rocks and be stored in the mineral structures themselves. Any kind of depleted natural gas field or oil field, you can, in the vacated spaces underground, in the shale and so on, you can pump that full of carbon dioxide. There are coal beds that, coal actually absorbs carbon dioxide, so like once a coal bed is mostly mined out, you can pump carbon dioxide in there and the coal will kind of mop it up. Some carbon dioxide can be stored in old salt mines. Again, the salt mines kind of absorb the carbon dioxide into the structure. It all sounds kind of hard to do, though, doesn't it? I mean, and that's kind of the problem here. You can do this as a demonstration technology. I can imagine we could take a big tanker full of compressed carbon dioxide to a depleted natural gas well, and instead of pumping methane out, pump carbon dioxide in, and voila, we have swept a problem under the rug. But that's not the way this is going to work. This has to be done on an industrial scale. I mean, however much carbon we're burning, we apparently need to put that much back into the ground. Well, again, those train tracks in Omaha, a mile-long coal train comes through every 5 minutes. Think of those giant oil tankers sitting out in the Gulf of Mexico and so on. We'd have to have just as much industrial effort taking carbon the other way. Where are we going to take all this carbon? I mean, this coal-fired power plant burned a trainload of carbon today, and now it's got a trainload of carbon dioxide it's got to go get somewhere. Not to say that this is impossible, but man, that's a whole industry that would have to be built. And we don't have any of it right now. And it would all have to be done in ways that are just incredibly safe. That carbon would have to stay in the ground forever and never get out. If something went wrong and the carbon dioxide started coming out of that old sedimentary rock or that old methane natural gas field or whatever, all of a sudden that carbon dioxide is in the atmosphere. We were trying to keep that from happening. Nobody's got a plan as to how exactly that would work. Okay. That being said, let's not get rid of CCS technology just yet. I mean, there are some advantages to CCS, and we certainly have a lot of fossil fuels still in the ground. I mean, this is of course the danger of like the A1FI scenario. The truth of the matter is we just get better and better at finding more and more oil and finding more and more coal and getting oil out of difficult spots and so on. Maybe we should just say we're going to keep doing that. Let's just invest in CCS technology and put the carbon back when we're done with it. Maybe. Now all these CCS technologies have power overhead. It makes your power plant less efficient when you capture the carbon dioxide and so on. But again, maybe this could be done. But you would be forgiven for looking across everything that we've done in this lecture today about mitigation and saying they all kind of seem like Band-Aid solutions. They all seem like, oh, let's make ourselves feel better by having solar panels on our roof. Or let's make ourselves feel better by having a wind power plant outside of the city or something like that. Or let's capture a little bit of the carbon dioxide or something like that. But these are not Band-Aid solutions if we can scale them up. Okay? If they are done on a big enough scale for a long enough period of time, these have real climate implications. None of them are going to get us back to pre-industrial temperatures anytime soon, but they can prevent the worst possible outcomes. And frankly, in our set of lectures here that are about solutions for global warming, that's in some ways as good as it's going to get. Maybe these aren't Band-Aids. Maybe it's not a bad idea to get some solar panels on your roof. I've actually had some calls out to some companies to look about getting solar panels on my roof. I got a big south-facing roof. I should be able to get lots of energy out of there. All right. As we wrap this lecture up, I have a couple questions for you. Question 4. Which of the following is not a renewable source of energy? Solar, wind, natural gas, or hydroelectric? Which of those is not considered a renewable form of energy? Take a look at your 4 options and make a choice. Get a little feedback before you move on to question 5.